When artist and musician Olivia Shortt tells the story, they do it with the help of their baritone saxophone and a few other things.
I'm working with a loop pedal, so I have a piece of hardware. And then I'm also using my voice and a couple of, literally a toy. I have this like little Apple toy from Fisher Price. That's the jingling you kind of hear partway into that. And then as well as a fan. It's kind of like a swoosh sound that's kind of clicked at the end.
But for Olivia, a classically trained saxophonist, music isn't just about what you hear. They're known for their bright, bold performance attire. And for this show, in the basement of Winona, a small bar in downtown Toronto, Olivia was decked out in a shiny silver jacket, sparkly blue pants, and a sequined Pink Panther t-shirt.
Especially coming from training in classical music, you are thinking so much about sound and this invisible thing that is filling the space. But I think other aspects of storytelling can be about like what you're wearing or just like what you're presenting visually. Just it's the things I love. I love sequins, I love sparkles, I love bright colors, I love patterns. I also like to work with Indigenous designers when I can, but I really I love dressing up in clothes and makeup and doing weird stuff with myself when I can.
Olivia Shortt was the artist in residence at the Jackman Humanities Institute from 2023 to 2024. A member of the Nipissing First Nation, they're a vocalist, composer, noisemaker, improviser, sound designer, video artist, drag artist, curator, and self-described weirdo. When it comes to their first love, the saxophone, you could say that it was a match made in elementary school heaven.
I think I remember being in grade 6 and, the middle school doing sort of like an instrument parade and showing us like different students were playing their instrument as they kind of went past, and we got to see what they sounded like. And I was just like, wow, that's really shiny. And it has a lot of buttons and it can do a lot of things. And it just felt like a very powerful instrument.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people wanted to play it. Anytime I've done teaching, I always see the baritone sats in the corner and I'm just like, don't worry, someone will come for you.
You'll find your... Well, I mean, I can relate because in middle school, I wanted to play the bass guitar and I got the baritone saxophone.
Yeah.
I think no one else wanted it.
That's
and
exactly
there was
what
8 kids who wanted the bass guitar. So
yeah,
that's
all right. But yeah, it's this weird instrument that I use the word weird, but I mean that in a really good way. For me, weird is this like fun thing. It's kind of like exploring what isn't necessarily like mainstream or more conventional or what people kind of expect. Yeah, it's this oddball instrument that really allows for exploration, and it doesn't really fit in anywhere in a way. Like, yes, you see it in jazz. Yes, you see it in experimental things. But, like, it doesn't really technically fit in. It came so late to the game.
It was in 1846. Is that right? When
yeah.
It was invented? Yeah.
Or patented, I think, around that time.
Yeah.
And while, the violin, for example, has hundreds of years of repertoire and ways of approaching it, and the saxophone still feels new.
I'm Melissa Gismondi, and this is Humanities at Large from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. Over the course of this season, I've been exploring the theme of absence through the work of JHI researchers. Later in the show, you'll hear about an opera Olivia's been working on, which has to do with the absence of artifacts, sacred belongings taken from Indigenous communities that are being held by museums and other institutions. But first, I asked Olivia about the relationship between absence, music, and storytelling.
For me, especially with music, we talked about absence as silence, and that is part of music, the space where there aren't necessarily notes or something being heard. But the fact is you're always hearing something when you're listening to music, whether there's a note on the saxophone or the piano or, a hit of the drum, or there's the space, which is in Western music, you'll see a symbol for that, a rest. So I've always thought of absence, kind of like silence in a way, or just the lack of certain things happening, or just breathing, almost like the breath in between things.
Right.
But I also think about it as space for the audience to kind of find themselves in. That in a lot of storytelling, you know, there can be a really direct route of offering a story where it's like, here's how it started, here's your characters, this is your location, this is the problem, this is how it's resolved.
Yeah.
And I like the absence of some of those things. It's kind of like going to an art gallery and you're just looking at a piece of art. Like, you see what you see and you will interpret what you interpret from it, but it's not necessarily, unless you're on a tour, you don't necessarily have someone dictating, or that artist dictating to you, like, this is what this means and this is what this is, and telling you all these little things. Sometimes you're just looking at a piece of art and going, I don't know anything, but I'm a person who has lived and have experience as a being in this universe. Like, what do I get from this? What do I interpret? Because sometimes, yeah, what I do doesn't always make sense to others. And I think that's great. I think that's really cool. And I kind of like when people have questions at the end. They're like, why were you doing that? I'm like, great. I love this question. This is cool. What prompts you to ask that? Like, what is it you're actually asking? Or, you know, it just makes people think. So I really like that. And I think that's important for my work, at least. So I was talking to my therapist today, mostly about friendships. We were chatting about this a lot because I've had some friendships that have ended.
So I was talking to my therapist today.
In talking to my therapist,
because I feel like that's where I'm reflecting on a lot lately, is
down these moments.
friendships from before the pandemic.
So the piece we just heard, and we heard a piece of that there, it opens with you telling a story, which you then loop and layer over and over. And the story is about a kind of absence, and more specifically, the breakdown of a friendship. Why was that a topic you wanted to explore?
That was literally, I had a therapy session that day, like that day of that performance at Winona.
Yeah.
And it was just what was on my mind, and it felt really relevant. And, you know, I'm a person of the internet. I like to engage with other people's content there. So I had also seen a bunch of people kind of talking about, you know, the loss of friendships, and because so much, you know, in media and a lot of art, we talk about like very intimate relationships, whether it's like you're someone you're married to, or common law partner, or, you know, whatever, however you describe it. But that relationships of all kinds can be really valuable and important. And so that was just, it was really just something that was on my mind that day.
We hear the anguish building as the piece unfolds, both in the instruments you play as well as in your vocals. And there was a person in the audience who really connected with the performance. And here's a clip of what they had to say about it.
Yeah, for me, I had a very hard day because I had a very weird conversation with a former friend of mine, which I lost. It was very weird, very painful.
And I think the music expressed that something is just like so disharmonic, but in a way that you can listen to it and that it reflects somehow something of your soul, what your soul has to deal with right now. Like, I think this is how it felt for me. And it was somehow for me very relieving, very beautiful, very intense, very, very, like, you know, special.
That's really sweet. Oh my God.
What does it mean to you to hear that clip and to get that kind of response to your art?
Yeah, I don't always get those sort of really, I guess it feels intimate, like to hear what they felt like this. This oftentimes, you know, you're in the midst of packing up everything. You're dealing with getting yourself off stage and getting all your things out. And so it's actually kind of nice to have it documented in this way and to hear someone talking more in depth about what it meant. And it's actually kind of nice to hear because also I'm listening, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to do. That's like, you know, people don't always get everything I'm doing, and that's great. And some people like get right to the point, and this person really like hit the nail on the head. And
Yeah.
so it's really nice.
It was amazing to see the kind of audience impact that Olivia could have with just their voice, their saxophone, and a few noisemakers. But during their residence at the JHI, Olivia was working on something much bigger in scale. The Museum of Lost and Found, subtitled Gaka Zotai Duug, is a site-specific, multidisciplinary opera that they wrote, produced, and are performing in. The opera's narrative explores the issue of museums and repatriation, the process of returning cultural property to its place of origin. Specifically, it focuses on items and ancestral remains that were taken from Indigenous communities and the conversations unfolding around their return.
You know, I was trying to create this large-scale, site-specific piece that interacts with the space it's in, but it's sort of absurdist, using elements of like surrealism, fragmentation, sort of the absence of a really direct narrative for the storytelling. And, you know, the text that you do here is a combination of either spoken or sung by some of the characters.
We're already at our first exhibit. If you look to your left, you'll see the first artifacts on our tour. Every tour is a little bit different, so stay focused, or we might lose you. Maybe you'll
You know, it is on the topic of repatriation of cultural items, objects, as well as ancestors, and, you know, what that conversation means, not only for the institution dealing with that at the time, but for the community that those items or ancestors might go home to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to learn more about rematriation in addition to repatriation, because there's more in rematriation about, like, you know, thinking about Indigenous protocols and also kind of thinking about the processes of the specific land and territory. And it's a really complicated thing. And
as
I don't want
opposed to like repatriation would be, okay, here are, you know, Western colonial laws, so we're going to approach the giving the object back under that logic and that mentality.
Yeah,
Is that
it's a
right?
lot. It's very Western colonial. You
Yeah.
know, there's all these. I'll just mention a little bit about the
Yeah.
U.S. because that's where my initial workshop happened and some of my research was focused. NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. It's from 1990, and it's one of these laws that was created to. It's supposed to help, and the thing is, when it was initially started, I don't think people were really enforcing it. You know, it's like, yay, we did it, return your stuff. And then it's just, that didn't happen. It's been more recent, I would say, in the last like decade, that in some institutions have been doing the work to send items home, to send ancestors home. But it's very complicated, not only because, you know, there's the financial toll, the emotional toll, but also just in general as a point of interest is that a lot of these items and ancestors were poorly labeled, incorrectly labeled. Sometimes institutions don't know how to find out where they should go home. Even like through deep study, it's like, well, you know, maybe there's a number of, say, Abenaki communities who are saying like, we would like these, you know, maybe it's a vase, a specific set of vases or something to come home. You don't necessarily know which specific community to send it to. So then you have to have this discussion with all of them to say like, hey, okay, how should we approach this? But that doesn't always happen in a really good intentioned way. And so, you know, I'm trying to look at the work of Robin Gray, who's doing a lot of work with rematriation, specifically at the University of Toronto. But yeah, it's very much like Indigenous led, but it's often led by women and like thinking about Indigenous feminism and still something I'm kind of figuring out and how to talk about it in this work. But at the core, this is about how do we talk about this? Right now, it's still very much a like Turtle Island, North America context, because if anyone is into this topic and you read about what's happening in other countries or like any parts of Europe, you know, countries like France are a lot stricter and don't really want to let go of a lot of these objects or ancestors for that matter. there's some museums who don't necessarily believe in this and don't want to return. And so that's another aspect of this whole conversation.
Just a note, in early 2024, new regulations under NAGPRA, again, that's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, came into effect in the U.S., requiring institutions to get permission from tribes to display human remains and cultural objects. As a result, many museums and galleries across the U.S. have closed their Indigenous exhibits. In Canada, there's no federal legislation regarding repatriation. It's up to individual museums to come up with a policy and consider requests on a case-by-case basis.
So here in Canada, museums currently hold more than 6 million artifacts from Indigenous nations, including, as we were talking about, the remains of ancestors. And I think this might seem like an obvious question, and I know you can't speak for everyone, but I wonder if, as you're sort of researching and thinking about this and connecting with the topic, if you can talk a bit about the impact of this absence, like what imprint it leaves behind, do you think?
Yeah. What I kept reading about, and especially I was reading about a lot of cases out west, like with Haida Gwaii, was that, thinking about objects having histories, and that, you do kind of imprint a history onto the things that are part of your life. Like, even if you don't think of them as like sentient things, like even thinking for me, like I think about the saxophone I play. I've played that saxophone for years. And it has traveled to many places with me, and like it has its own little nicks and scratches and dents from things that have happened. And thinking about how much history it holds as an object, yes, it is a piece of metal, but it also is a container for these histories. And that was sort of the thing I was seeing time and time again from sort of people talking about these case studies and what it meant when they were able to bring cultural items home or their own ancestors home, knowing that not only, especially with their ancestors, that someone could come home and be buried properly with ceremony and the protocols of their own community, but that with cultural items, it's like a part of your history is coming home in a physical sense, but also just like all the history carried in that object. And that's something that has really stuck with me in this, is just, especially for people just trying to heal from a lot of colonial trauma and intergenerational trauma, and reclaiming your culture, reclaiming language. It's a part of a healing process. You'll see different institutions who've had really successful processes, like they inviting a specific community to their institution, being able to do the ceremonies there, being able to, like, if it's your ancestor, bringing someone home who's been away for a long time. That's huge. It's huge for healing. Yeah.
So I know you wrote the libretto. Are you performing in it? Like, will you perform in all the different site-specific performances?
At the moment, yes, I am in it. And that is sort of the nature sometimes of self-producing. You're like, I'll just do 20 jobs. As many artists will know. Yeah, I ended up, I have this character, and it's kind of related to my solo practice. I've named them Nina Bougie, which is a play on Nana Bojo, which is the trickster character. And I find having a character that I can kind of, it's not just venting, but being able to be really blunt about stuff, where you're like, yeah, I'm going to give a land acknowledgement, but I'm also going to say a bunch of stuff about this specific institution and call them out at their own festival, and talk about their own history. And it's sometimes easier, at least for me, and this is where I'm not a trained actor or anything, but I really relate to theater people, because I'm like, oh yeah, you just like, it is you, but it's also not you. So it's a place where I can feel really comfortable saying these really direct offerings to the audience. But yeah, I am performing in it currently as Nina Bougie in a non-singing role.
So I saw an event listing, because Nina Bougie, it's a recurring character.
Yes.
I saw a listing that described Nina Bougie as a, quote, weird drag-adjacent two-spirit trickster friend who is always ready to stir up chaotic energy in the room. Is that an accurate description,
Yes.
do you think?
I
Yeah.
wrote that
You
description.
wrote that. There you go.
Yes.
Nina Bougie, Indigo, imaginary friend. Nina Bougie, Indigo, and their imaginary friend seasons, fiends, demons, and frolicking fish sticks. The monster under your bed is real. The monster under your bed is real. The monster under your
As Olivia mentioned, this recurring character, a kind of alter ego named Nina Bougie, is a play on a trickster figure from traditional Anishinaabe storytelling. I asked Olivia what it is about this figure that inspires them.
In a lot of communities, there's a trickster character.
Mm-hmm.
For us, like Nana Bojo is often a rabbit, but not always. If anyone has ever gone to the Wasagachek festival that Native Earth Performing Arts does, they have a cutout of a coyote, and Wasagachek is the Cree version of the trickster. And it's this character that isn't necessarily good, but they're not necessarily bad. And I sort of like that idea of this character that is doing things. Sometimes it's to help. Sometimes it's for their own self-indulgence. They're self-centered. But I love that there's always this aspect of, with the stories around the trickster, that there's something to learn from them.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not them teaching you it, it's through an action they've done. And I think that's really why, it's like, oh yeah, Nina is Nana Bojo, and sort of a Nana Bojo character. You can talk to a lot of people with this character,
Mm-hmm.
even if they don't necessarily agree with you, whether it's politically or spiritually or, I don't know, emotionally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You don't have to agree on things, but you can take a lot from this character. And that's why.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn now to talk a bit about your path to becoming the artist that you are today. And we sort of started there, so we'll come full circle a little bit. You grew up in North Bay as an only child. You've said you spent a lot of time alone listening to music. What were you listening to back then?
I ended up with a lot of cassettes and CDs from my mom and my uncle.
Mm-hmm.
And then my dad would sometimes buy me something random, and that would end up added into the collection. So, we had the very dramatic Meatloaf. Listened to a lot of that. I wish I could find this. It was a powwow CD that my dad had, and I would walk around the house as a little kid trying to mimic it, because there's some really, I won't do it here because it's loud, but there's really high pitched, loud, they're kind of like, huh, huh, but much higher.
Mm-hmm.
I also was listening to Bare Naked Ladies, the stuff my uncle had given me. It was Warren Zevon. Werewolf in London was a classic. AC/DC, Muddy Waters, a lot of older blues. My favorite cassette, I think it's from the 60s. It's the Hammond Organ Dance Party, and there's no singing on it. It's a collection of what I feel like are random songs, but it's I think songs from the 50s and 60s. La Bamba is on there. House of the Rising Sun
Mm-hmm.
is on there, and it's all done on this Hammond organ with the vibrato turned up. And once in a while there's drum kit on it. It's supposed to be a party mix, but with a Hammond organ. And I listen to that a lot.
You mentioned Meatloaf and AC/DC and that kind of. What do you think it was about that kind of music that connected for you?
Well, Meatloaf is very dramatic.
The
Meatloaf,
theatricality.
oh yeah,
yeah.
His music is really well orchestrated. He has these huge ensembles of performers. I love his voice. I think he had a great voice. There's also a lot of storytelling in his music. Often, if you get his albums, there's these clips that are not the music. It's, if if I can remember part of it, it's like him and this woman going back and forth, like, on this hot summer night, would you offer your throat to the wolf with the red roses? And you're like, what does that even mean?
On a hot summer night, would you offer your throat to the wolf with the red roses?
Will he offer me his mouth?
Yes.
Will he offer me his teeth?
Yes.
But I loved it. I was just like, yes, I'm in.
Yeah.
And, you know, of course, his stuff got turned into a musical, and like he was always kind of working in this sort of rock opera way. And Warren Zevon, again, another like very dramatic song, is this Werewolves in London. You know, there's literally parts where he's going, ah, woo, werewolves in London. And like, it's kind of ridiculous. Like, he talks about, you know, a wolf murdering someone in the side. You're like, what is happening?
There's a lot of wolves, I'm thinking, with Meatloaf too. And, yeah.
With like AC/DC and all that. Again, these bands were really good. They really knew how to play their instruments. I think that was it. They were just like absolutely incredible musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, even though it's kind of like dad rock, it's like really good dad rock. You're like, this is the good stuff. You know, this is the like 90s terrible dad rock.
Yeah. And when did you know that you wanted to sort of pursue a career and a life as a musician? How did that sort of come about for you?
So when I went to study music, I didn't really have a game plan. It was, I finished high school. I had realized at some point I didn't want to be a veterinarian.
Was that your plan before?
Yeah, when I was younger, you know, like middle school, early high school, I was like, yeah, I'll do sciences and math and be a vet.
Yeah.
And then I realized I don't really like those things. And music just felt like the right thing to go and study. And I had gone into a couple programs, and I had lived in North Bay almost my entire life. I'd grown up there, and at that point, it was just like, well, I want to be somewhere else. And then I went to Toronto, and I hadn't really been to Toronto much before that. I think I'd been like once or twice maybe, and I did my audition, and I met my potential teacher, and just seeing the campus and the city, I was like, I think this is what is right for me. So I kind of just followed that, which is very much a common theme in my life, is sort of trying to follow my intuition and see what, like, now it's a combination of like making sure it's like, does this match with my values? Is this what I want to do? But also just sometimes it's like, well, this feels like the right thing to do. And that hasn't really led me astray for the most part. I think the reason I'm drawn to experimental music is very much related to how I approach stuff, because it's, let's just try stuff. Let's play. Let's experiment. You can throw a bunch of things at the wall and see what feels really good by doing it. And so that's what kind of a number of these different sort of moments happened where I had mentioned Native Earth performing arts earlier because I feel like they're very important to me and to kind of how I've gone to this place, because a previous managing director, Isaac Thomas, he had reached out and goes, I heard you're working with dancers. You should apply to the festival, and the Wasagachek Festival, and you should submit something. And I was just kind of like, I hadn't really written music at this point. I was like, I don't know what I would make. What am I going to do? But then it was just that thing of, worst case, you apply and they say no. And that's okay. So I applied and they were like, you're in.
What year was this, would you say?
That was 2017.
Okay.
Yeah. And then also because I was sort of wanting to do a bit of storytelling around stuff with my family, all I could think of was I had all these cassettes that I used to listen to. And I was like, how could I work with cassette players? And I was like, I don't know. But like, I ended up borrowing 8 different cassette players. And then, again, I knew nothing. But I bought blank cassette tapes. I asked some friends to record some text I had written and just asked them to say it in different ways. I didn't know how to get the recording from my laptop onto the cassette. And I didn't know who to ask. So I just went from like, well, what if? And I got a microphone and I hung it over my laptop like the lo-fi dork I was at the time, because I didn't know what to do. And just was like, whatever. It'll be like a spooky lo-fi effect. I'll just do this. And that's how I initially like did all these cassettes. And I was working with a dancer named Kathleen Legasic, and we figured out like the choreography of her pushing, each cassette to play and then dancing in reaction to it. And I didn't know how to edit anything. So I got Audacity, which is a free software. And I'm pretty sure I just watched YouTube tutorials and then clicked a bunch of things. And I saw the effects tab and was like, ooh, what do I do there? And just chopped it up and just tried stuff. And it did inspire something where I was like, okay, I don't know if it was a perfect piece in any sense. There's definitely some rough aspects to it, but I was just like, oh, this is definitely a starting point. And what ended up happening is I just kept submitting the things. And there was a quartet in New York that had a call in 2019. They're the Jack Quartet. And they work with a lot of famous people. They're a very well-known quartet. They do a lot of experimental and classical like music that gets framed either as avant-garde or new music. And they had a call and I was just like, why not? I'll just submit whatever. And all I had at the time, I had videos of these 2 pieces. I'd done it with Saga Check, and I think one video of me playing and improvising. And I was just like, well, this is what I have. And I got picked, which shocked me and was really a wonderful surprise. It's just like things kind of, not that they fell into place, because like I had to apply and I had to do stuff in order for it to happen, but it was like just all these things that kind of followed my intuition to be like, I think this is where I'm supposed to be.
I want to close by just sort of talking about sort of just where we are today in terms of arts and the arts landscape. And so as you were saying, it's being an artist, trying to make a living as an artist can be piecemeal, like a little bit here, not knowing what the future holds. I know it can be really difficult making plans because, it's funding is always up in the air. I know there have been increases to arts funding in this year's federal budget, but it's still highly competitive. And I know the process can be really frustrating. So for you as someone working across so many platforms and media, I'm curious how you feel about the vitality of the arts landscape today, where we are right now.
I think there is a lot of hope. I think it can be easy to feel sad about, funding and whatever is happening with arts councils, because at least in Canada, that's how a lot of artists rely on making their work, is by applying to Canada Council or Ontario or wherever you live. But then, I read books where, I'm reading this book on the last 50 years of video art history, and it's by a curator at the MoMA, Barbara London. And it reminded me that I think there's kind of these waves and sort of an ebb and flow of what is happening economically in any country. There's always been some kind of up and down, and also just even artists. I think we should pay artists more. I'm not advocating for difficult artist life. I think that is terrible, and I think everybody needs to be paid way better. But I was reading about like Laurie Anderson working in New York, in Manhattan, when you could still be an artist living in like Greenwich Village or something and squatting in a house and no one cared. I don't think that's a glamorous lifestyle, but it does remind me that like people often find a way to do things. And whether it's you have your Joe job and you work at a coffee shop during the day, and then that allows you, at least, you pay rent, you get your groceries, you can do your art. Or you're Laurie Anderson in like the 70s and 80s squatting in some random apartment in New York City. There isn't stability in any job. And I think people are really seeing that right now too, outside of the arts. But I think there is a strength and innovativeness in artists that is very much a callback to previous decades. And I think right now I am seeing more and more people being really creative about where they put their art, whether it's music or theater or visual arts, they're finding ways and new places to present that. And it's that thing of course it's coming from a place of, trying to financially back yourself, but just being creative and being like, well, I still want to make art and I still want to do this thing, and art will find a way. Feels very cheesy, but I feel like I see so many innovative people doing the coolest things I've ever seen now. And that is exciting.
Do you see that amongst non-artists that there's maybe greater appreciation for art, or that can change as well? Or maybe change is the wrong word, but that it's a two-way relationship.
Yeah, I even thinking about that clip of that audience member, I don't know if they have an artistic practice or not, but you can be affected in so many ways by something you didn't expect to affect you. And I think society needs that, the space to self-reflect, to think deeply about themselves, their own place in this world. The context of like right now is really important, and that's really part of the two-way relationship, I think.
Olivia Shortt was the JHI Artist in Residence from 2023 to 2024. You can see and hear more of their work on their website, Olivia-Shortt, that's short with 2 T's.com. Humanities at Large is a podcast from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe, share this episode, and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps to get the word out. I'm Melissa Gismondi, and I'll be back again in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening.